Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of season 4 of The Sopranos. Now, before I go and share my thoughts on this season, I want to give a special shout out to Shine for requesting this review as well as reviews of the entire series. And if there's another TV show, film, or topic that you would like to see me discuss in the future, feel free to donate to either my PayPal or my Patreon. Link is in the video description down below, and I will try to get to your request as soon as I possibly can. Now, season 4, in my opinion, isn't quite as good as season 3, but it's still a really good season for the most part. Uh, it's It's definitely better than season 1, and honestly, I think it's better than some of the later seasons that came out afterwards as well. Because those seasons really got very dark, and I get it, but I prefer this show when it's not just super dark and gritty and depressing. I prefer this show when there's some lighthearted shenanigans and other stuff, and as well as heavy drama. I like it when it has a balance of those things. I felt like as the show went on, it got a little bit uh, more imbalanced in terms of the overall tone. But I will get to that later on when I talk about season 5 and 6. But season 4 was still really strong. The main cast, of course, returns. James Gandolfini is Tony Soprano. Lorraine Bracco is his therapist, Jennifer Melfi. Eddie Falco is Carmela Soprano, Tony's wife. Michael Imperioli is Christopher, Tony's cousin. Dominique Chianci as Junior Soprano. Stephen Van Zandt as Silvio. Tony Sirico as Paulie. Robert Eiler as AJ Soprano. Jamie-Lynn Sigler as Meadow. Drea De Matteo as Adriana, Ada Turturro as Janice, Federico Castelluccio as Furio, John Ventimiglia as Artie, Vincent Curatola as Johnny Sack, Stephen R. Shrippa as Bobby Bacalari, Joe Pantoliano as Ralph Cifaretto, and some reoccurring cast members, Dan Grimaldi as Patsy, and even names like Peter Reigert, who was there for a handful of episodes as Ronald Zellman. Now, the first episode, the premiere of season 4, is called For All Debts, Public and Private, and it's directed by Alan Coulter and written by David Chase. And it's a decent way to start off the season. It's not one of my favorite season premieres. And there are other episodes in this season I like more, but it's still good. This one takes place like 20 months after the events of after the end of season 3. And it starts off in an interesting fashion with Paulie being in prison because he was arrested on a gun charge. So that creates a different sort of dynamic for like the first 3 episodes because Paulie's not there and he's not interacting with the rest of the crew. And he's calling Johnny Sack and he's not happy with how Tony is handling Paulie being in prison. He interprets Tony not calling him, not keeping tabs on him, as Tony not really caring about him at all. And so he essentially complains to Johnny about that. Ralphie winds up cheating on Rosalie with Janice because he's a scumbag. Tony admits to his therapist that he feels that there's only 2 ways out of his business, which are being dead or in the can. So because of that, he starts to have a lot of thoughts about what he should do going forward when it comes to operating his business. And so that's when he decides to focus on Christopher to take over. So he celebrates this occasion by giving Chris this gift, which is the address of this cop who killed Chris's father. And so Chris tracks the guy down, goes into his house, guns him down, uh, kills him, and takes a $20 bill from his wallet and then pins it to his mother's fridge. And that's the end shot of the season premiere. I really like the hard zoom in on the $20 bill and the music choice they use for the end credits. Um, so yeah, it's not, in my opinion, a tremendous, amazing episode, but it's still a good one. And it's a good way to start things when it comes to this particular season and the various different arcs that are gonna be followed throughout this season. Episode 2 of season 4 is called No Show. It's directed by John Patterson, featuring a script by Terrence Winter and David Chase. And this is another one that's all right. It's fine. It's not one of my favorites, but it's still a good episode. Uh, I like that this is where you first hear about the joke when it comes to Ralphie making fun of Johnny Sack's wife, talking about this 95-pound mole on her ass. And this is something that later on throughout the season actually becomes a big deal, which I found to be really funny. But I'll get into that later when we get into Johnny Sack not being able to take a joke. Uh, but this is where this joke originates from and where you first hear it. Paulie's nephew repeats this joke while visiting uh, him, and so now Paulie knows about this joke. And Chris is made temporary capo of Paulie's men, which upsets Patsy. So this then leads to Patsy and Silvio stealing from their no work job against Tony's wishes and a bit of retaliation. The FBI brings in Adriana and they basically strong arm her and demand her to become an informant. I get what they're doing here with Adriana, but at the same time, this is more of the same that we already had with Pussy. And just to do this whole thing with the FBI again and the same song and dance and the whole, oh, is she gonna get found out and when and what's gonna happen to her if she gets found out? Like, is she gonna actually be able to go into witness protection? Like, that's not gonna happen. So it just feels like they're rehashing some stuff at this point with Adriana and her becoming an informant. Meadow has an arc in this episode where she's depressed and lacking motivation because of Jackie's death, and she doesn't want to go to school and is talking about not going to school for a year and then going to Europe, and of course that upsets Tony and Carmela. And Tony, after Carmela told him that Meadow was struggling with the death of Jackie and lacking motivation, Tony recommends Meadow to go to a therapist that was recommended to him by Jennifer, and that backfires because the therapist actually does recommend that Meadow take a year off and go to Europe, and even offers some references so she could possibly go to Europe and also go to school. And this leads to an argument between Meadow and her dad, Tony. And you're thinking that, okay, she's just going to leave and go to Europe. But that's actually not what happens. She decides to stay home and goes back to college. And the motivation behind that move is kind of muddled and doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Because it seemed like Meadow really wanted to go to Europe, really wanted to take a year off, and seemed to be very adamant about that. But then she doesn't commit to that and just goes back to school and stays home. And maybe because she was intimidated by Tony, maybe that's what happened there. But I don't know. Like it just felt like a bit of a muddled aspect of her arc in this episode. So it's not a bad episode at all, but It's not one of my favorites. Episode 3, though, Christopher, which is directed by Tim Van Patten, featuring a story by Michael Imperioli and Maria Laurino, with a teleplay by Imperioli. This is the first episode that I really liked out of this season. I thought this is a great episode. This is where Junior's trial starts, and so there's a lot of the extra stress and drama that's being associated with that. And there is also some added surprise tragedy involving Bobby and his wife, which is a big part of what makes this episode so genuinely memorable, because that whole bit is just so tragic and devastating, and you can't help but really sympathize with Bobby when it comes to his wife's death. And then, of course, Janice, being the type of person that she just swoops in and is trying to move in with Bobby, and basically already trying to replace his dead wife, uh, because she realizes she doesn't want to be with Ralphie because Ralphie reminds her too much of Richie, and she wants to be with a nicer guy who's sensitive, and she sees a lot of the traits that she wants in a relationship now with Bobby. So she breaks up with Ralphie and even kicks him down the stairs. And you also have a really funny satirical uh, subplot that's going on throughout this episode that deals with the crew and how they just cannot handle the fact that there's a protest going on by Native Americans about Christopher Columbus on Columbus Day, because they feel that the Italians are the real ones that are getting discriminated against, and that Christopher Columbus is a great Italian hero. And it leads to some absolutely hilarious moments and some iconic scenes. Uh, there is a reason why that whole outburst that Tony has at the dinner table is considered by a lot of Sopranos fans to be a choice cut, so to speak, when it comes to the series, because it's just some great acting by James Gandolfini, and the entire scene is just gold. Where his kids are explaining to Tony the reality of Columbus, and that he was really not necessarily a hero and was kind of a piece of shit. And Tony just gets all hot and bothered about it. And he's all like, in our household, Christopher Columbus is a hero. End of story. And that continues throughout the episode, with his crew just continually being annoyed and upset about the protest, especially Silvio. And and so what happens is there is actually a physical confrontation with some of the mob guys and other Italians who show up at the protest, and they start fighting and people get arrested. And prior to that, they tried to put a stop to the protest in typical mob fashion, with intimidation, with blackmail, with trying to buy off this guy who owns this really fancy big time casino, who's like barely even Native American. And it all doesn't work. It all completely falls apart. I mean, they're even trying to blackmail the Indians with Iron Eyes Cody, the guy from the old 70s commercials who was crying because there was litter on the ground. And I love the writing in this, where the Native American guy who's like the head of the protest, he's like, who the hell is Iron Eyes Cody? And so the one piece of evidence they're trying to use to try to blackmail the Indians that's with Iron Eyes Cody, this Italian guy who played a Native American in these old 70s commercials. They're like, well, I don't even know who the hell that is. And because of everything that happens with the protests and the guys in the crew get arrested, Tony has to deal with that shit. And so the episode ultimately concludes with Tony in the car with Christopher and Silvio, and Silvio is continuing to just complain about the protests and about the Italian discrimination, and then Tony just completely snaps, and it's a really crowd pleasing moment where he's all like, "Would you just shut the fuck up about this Italian discrimination? Not everybody is a fucking victim, okay?" Yeah. And so he just completely just roasts them when it comes to their complaining and crying and moaning about being victimized. And it's a great performance by Gandolfini, and it's one of my favorite moments from Tony, to be honest, when he's just annoyed by all of his bullshit and just disparages the notion that everybody is a victim. And it's something that honestly is really relevant today in the age of cancel culture and people crying victim and crying foul for the most ridiculous reasons. And yes, there are some justified reasons that people are crying foul or saying they're a victim of, but there's a lot of other stuff that people are saying they're being victimized for that's a bunch of bullshit. And I love that this episode points all of that out and just really does some great job and provides some really a good satire when it comes to uh, really poking fun at this overall notion. Now, episode 4 is called The Wait. It's directed by Jack Bender, featuring a script by Terrence Winter. And this is where the joke about Johnny's wife really starts to boil over, because Johnny finds out about it, so he's furious. So he winds up setting up a meeting between the DeMeo and the Lupertazzi families to try to whack Ralphie for a joke about his wife being fat. And I just thought that was hilarious because I'm like, dude, it's a joke. It's a fucking joke. Like, have you ever heard that before? I mean, you've never heard a fat joke at your wife's expense? Just get over it. It's a joke. There's not a reason to kill somebody over it, but he can't let it go. And boss Carmine Lupertazzi, he approves of killing Johnny because this is just ridiculous and need to take him out. Silvio and Chris then arrange a hit on Johnny, but Johnny puts one out on Ralphie because Ralphie's the one that said the joke. Johnny goes to see his father, I think in Boston, and that's where he will be killed, but he forgets something, discovers that his wife was actually cheating on her diet, was trying to eat a bunch of candy bars. And so, understandably feeling upset and hurt that she lied to him, he ultimately calls off the hit on Ralphie. And so, because of that, the hit that was going to be put out on Johnny doesn't go through. And they have some stuff with Melfi and her son, where her son is acting out of college because he might be still feeling guilt over his mom's assault in the parking garage. Um, Carmela and Tony, they argue about money. Carmela wants him to sign some papers for some kind of trust so she can feel secure in her finances. And Tony is understandably a little bit leery about it. Um, and while she's doing all of this and trying to essentially get Tony to commit to her fully or even more by doing a trust and doing all this stuff financially and really strengthening the commitment between him and his wife, she's fantasizing about fucking Furio. And this is an example out of many as to why Carmela is just a massive hypocrite. And I I find it to be cringe, but like cringe in a good way when it comes to her being all, you've got to do this, Tony. You got to sign this trust. You got to do all of this. If you really love me, you got to sign the trust. And here she is dancing with Furio at his housewarming party, helping him buy a house. And even while she's having sex with Tony, she's fantasizing about being with Furio because she's imagining that she's hearing the music that she and Furio dance to while she and Tony are making love. So, yeah, total hypocrite. And it's it's definitely an episode that sets up some dominoes that are going to fall later on. Episode 5 is called Pyomai. This one is directed by Henry J. Bronstein, featuring a script by Robin Green and Mitchell Burgess. And this is where the FBI continues to press Adriana. She gives them a tip about Patsy. Janice is moving in even more uh, on Bobby and his home life, trying to get him to stop being so sad about his wife's death and essentially fall in love with her. Uh, it's being very manipulative and in kind of a scummy way with this whole like, I'm trying to be a good person and I'm gonna be here for Bobby and be here for his kids and all of that. But really, it's very superficial and selfish when it comes to what she's doing. She wants to do that because she wants to move in with Bobby and take advantage of this situation and this opening with his wife's death. I mean, she's even going to the point where she's doing all this stuff where she's lying about her being able to cook and make all these meals when all they are is stuff that have been given to Bobby by other people, and she's like giving them to Junior and other people and saying that it's something that she made. And she's trying to get a Bobby to eat the baked ziti that his wife made before she died. Like, being very manipulative and lame, and just disguising it as being helpful and kind and courteous. And a lot of the episode, though, really isn't focusing on that stuff. It's focusing more on Pyomai, this racehorse that Ralphie owns, and it starts winning races in large part because of advice that Tony gives, and because of that, Tony feels like he's entitled to more and more of the winnings when it comes to Pyomai's success on the track. And Ralphie, he agrees. He gives him more money because he feels like Tony deserves it and feels like Tony definitely is the one that is definitely contributing more to Pyomai's success. But he doesn't want to pay for Pyomai when Pyomai is sick and the vet calls and needs payment, and he just refuses to pay. So he really doesn't give that much of a shit about his horse. And Tony finds this out firsthand late one night when the vet calls him because Ralphie gave the vet Tony's number. So now Tony has to go middle of the night, take care of this situation, pay the vet, and he spends the night with Pyomai in the stable and consoles the horse. And this is really where he starts to build a genuine connection with this animal. And it's honestly pretty sweet. And I love the end shot of this episode. It's a gorgeous looking shot. The cinematography in this shot is amazing. with Tony in the stable, consoling and petting Pyomai while Pyomai is ailing. It's just a really great shot. One of the most striking shots in the entire series. So that's an episode I definitely do enjoy. A lot of it has to do with the Pyomai angle. Episode 6 is called Everybody Hurts. This episode is directed by Steve Buscemi, featuring a script by Michael Imperioli. And this one definitely starts out with some pretty heavy stuff. Um, Tony finds out that Gloria killed herself, and that leads to him really being upset at Jennifer when he goes to have a meeting with her. Goes to the session with her because she never told him, and so that leads to a really tense confrontation between the two. Um, and Tony, because of what happened with Gloria, he decides to start doing nice things for people to distract himself from the guilt of possibly being a major factor in her suicide. So this is why he agrees to give Artie a loan from Tony, um, so Artie can distribute this. It's not really vodka, but like it's called Armagnac or Armagnac, which is a brandy. It's like a different sort of spirit. Yeah, it's a distinctive kind of brandy, and spirit maybe isn't the right word, but it's. I'm not really an alcohol expert, but he gets this idea from this guy who is related to the hostess at his restaurant, that this is going to be this next big thing in alcohol, and all that happens is he gets scammed. The supplier for this alcohol starts ignoring his calls. Artie then decides to go and confront the guy at his hotel, and Artie starts getting physical with him, and because Artie's a bit of a pussy, he just gets his ass kicked. And then because of the fact that he got his ass kicked, he tries to kill himself with pills, calls Tony. Tony calls 911. And Tony, because of everything that happened with Artie, even though the money is gone, he agrees to forgive the loan for Artie as long as Artie drops his tab at the restaurant. And gives him the money from the man who Furio is sent to go collect from. And then Artie praises Tony for guessing what was going to happen from the start, which pisses off Tony. Understandably so, to be honest, especially after everything that Artie did and put Tony through. I mean, right after he already heard about what happened to Gloria, now here his friend Artie is trying to kill himself too. And AJ has this whole thing where he visits the home of his new girlfriend, sees how wealthy she is. He feels bad for some reason because she never told him. And his friends give him shit because he doesn't have Don Corleone money. And then he's like, I don't know. And like the whole stuff with AJ and his girlfriend, like, don't really care. It's definitely a weaker element in this season. Uh, it's not a bad episode, but it's not a great episode either. It's just another episode that's just kind of there for me. Um, Episode 7 is called Watching Too Much Television. This one is directed by John Patterson, featuring a story by David Chase and Robin Green and Mitchell Burgess, as well as Terrence Winter. It features a teleplay by Terrence Winter and Nick Santora. And this is the episode where Paulie winds up getting released from prison. So you're 7 episodes in, and that's when Paulie shows up. And honestly, even at that point, he's not really in a lot of scenes for the rest of the season. He's in it a little bit, and he definitely makes an impression, especially in one particular episode. Um, but he isn't really like a major part of things. So he's released from prison, but he is upset that Tony didn't contact him still. Adriana watches an episode of a show, and because she's kind of dumb, she gets this honestly really foolish impression that spouses don't have to testify. They can't be forced to testify against each other. That leads to her proposing to Chris. Um, he gets pissed off though when she tells him that she might not be able to conceive, but he ultimately accepts after Tony and Silvio talk to him and get him to understand that he might be in the wrong there. Adriana learns that she was completely wrong about the whole can't be forced to testify, and unwraps her presents at the bridal shower with no sense of joy, which is normally what you get in that situation. Carmela's cousin tips Tony off to a mortgage fraud scheme he can get in on. So he makes use of this assembly man named Ronald Zellman to purchase several houses. One of them has been turned into a crack house. So Zellman pressures his friend into sending an armed group of teenagers to scare the occupants away. But that's actually not Zellman who pressures him. It's Tony. Tony is the one that decides to go this route. Because he showed up at the house and he got into a bit of a confrontation with the people there, and he was really upset that this house is a crack house. So he wound up doing the whole stuff, get the teenagers, get somebody to, scare the occupants away because I'm not going to go forward with this if you don't do that. And after the scheme pays out, Zellman and his friend wonder what happened to their morals, but then ultimately don't give a shit, especially his friend, because they used to stand up for things and protest stuff at college and used to be the type of individuals that would be a part of these demonstrations for civil rights and all this other stuff. And they don't really give a shit anymore because that doesn't pay. Tony learns that Zellman is dating Irina, and initially he doesn't give a shit, but then he gets drunk and then decides to bust into Zellman's house and whip him with a belt, because the fact that he's banging Irina, and that's the end of that episode. um, uh, I liked it more than episode 6, mainly for the mortgage fraud thing. I felt that was definitely a little intriguing. Um, episode 8 is called Mergers and Acquisitions. This one's directed by Dan Attias, featuring a story by David Chase and Robin Green, Mitchell Burgess, Terrence Winter, and a teleplay by Lawrence Connor. This is where Furio winds up going back to Italy, to Naples, because his father is dead. And this is where he confesses to his uncle that he is also in love with Carmela. His uncle is like, "Hey, you can't do that. If you decide that you really want to do that, though, you're gonna have to kill Tony." Uh, Paulie's mother, Nucci, moves into a retirement community where she's ostracized by a group that one of her friends is in. That whole angle, did not give a shit about. Anything involving the retirement community is honestly some of the weakest elements of this show. I don't care. I don't care about the moms and or the grandpas or any of it. I don't It's not that I don't care about the predicament that these elderly people are in or have to be in these homes, because my grandmother is in a home, but I just don't really care about the drama there. That I don't care. I don't care about, oh, they don't They don't want me to be a part of their group. They're treating me badly, Polly. Like, I don't give a shit. I don't care. Um, Polly pays off the woman's son. This woman who starts the whole shit with Nucci, but nothing changes. So then he has the men come in and break his arm. Uh, his wife threatens to pull his mother out of the home unless she's kinder to Nucci. So eventually she relents and decides to stop being such a bitch for literally no reason. Um, Ralphie's new girlfriend, Valentina La Paz, she helps commission a portrait of Tony and Pyomai. Tony then starts to have an affair with her, but she refuses to keep going. Um, and actually, it's Tony who refuses to keep going unless she breaks up with Ralphie, and she eventually does. There's also a lot of this extra added drama involving Tony not wanting to fully commit to this affair unless he finds out that Ralphie did or did not actually have sex with her, because he finds out this thing that Ralphie has this kink where he likes to be tortured, or likes a lot of S&M stuff, or he likes to be pegged, or this other stuff. So Tony's trying to find out whether or not uh she has been penetrated by Ralphie. And it's another element of just absurdity when it comes to this show and this overall season. Like, this is what you're really passionate about, whether or not Ralphie penetrated her pussy. Like, I mean, it's not about. So that's the thing that's bothering you, not the fact that you're going to have another affair with your wife. It's whether or not Ralphie penetrated that pussy. And yeah, it's just a further example of just these absurd conflicts that go on throughout this show. Like Johnny Sack and the joke about his wife's weight, and the whole stuff with the Italian discrimination, and Columbus Day and the protest. And eventually Carmela discovers one of Valentina's fake nails in Tony's clothes. So she winds up stealing some of the money from the bird feeder and invests it with the stockbroker without Tony's knowledge. And she actually leaves the nail for him to find, just to continue to fuck with him, play mind games. He and Carmela, at the end of the episode, they basically have this moment between one another where they try to get a confession out of each other, but it doesn't work. And instead they just sit there silently and don't say anything. But you get the gist that they know what happened. And they know what went on. And Tony is now aware that Carmela knows about Valentina, and Tony is also aware that Carmela took the money from the bird feeder. Now, episode 9 is called Whoever Did This. This one is directed by Tim Van Patten, featuring a script by Robin Green and Mitchell Burgess. This is one of the best episodes of this season, and honestly, one of the best episodes of the entire series. This is the last episode that features Ralphie alive, and it's an episode that honestly starts out in a way that really lulls you into this false sense of security in terms of Ralphie being alive by the end of it. Because you're like, how in the hell are they going to do something to Ralphie when his son is injured and is in a coma in the hospital? So you're like, how in the hell is that going to happen? Because that's what happens. Ralphie's son is hit in the chest with an arrow while playing with his friend, leaving him in a coma with brain damage. This leads to Ralphie being just a wreck. He thinks God is punishing his son, and because of what he did, and he just feels guilt and all kinds of remorse. Ralphie goes and asks the priest Phil for advice, tries to do right by the April family. So here you actually see the character who has been represented as a honestly irredeemable piece of shit who beat a woman to death in season 3, who might have been carrying his child, who actually not might was carrying his child, and has just been an absolute asshole. And now his son is dying, and his son is in a really tough spot, and you're like, man, this guy's a piece of shit, but I still can't help but kind of feel bad for him. And that's the brilliance of this episode, is that it actually makes you sympathize with the piece of shit like Ralphie Cifaretto. And Pat Leono's acting in this episode is amazing too. I mean, he earned that award that he got for this episode and then some. Um, so yeah, it it's an episode that starts out with this accident, and immediately it draws you in. Junior's trial is continuing as well. Tony comes up with this idea to have Junior start to fake dementia to try to force a mistrial. Um, and it backfires in a way because he actually starts to show signs of legitimate dementia. So there's this whole thing about him feigning memory loss, but he actually is starting to have memory loss issues. And the episode ultimately ends, though, in a really violent fashion because the stable housing Pyomai was burnt down, which killed Pyomai. And Tony goes to the burnt down stables and is just absolutely devastated. And then he goes back to Ralphie's place because he starts to put things together. He starts to piece things together when it comes to Ralphie's medical bills and how it coincides with the stables being burnt down. So he confronts Ralphie at his home and leads to a verbal argument initially. And then throughout this verbal back and forth, Tony has another realization that he was right when it comes to his assumption that Ralphie was the one behind the stable burning down. And so he can't handle that. And so he just explodes in a rage and just beats Ralphie to death. And then, he calls Chris, and then they dispose of the body. They chop it up. That's where you find out that Ralphie was wearing a toupee the entire time. It's very morbid. It's very dark, but there's also a little bit of dark humor to it as well. And it's an episode that features some really great acting by Joe Ponciano and James Gandolfini, and it's got some really effective drama. And if you've never seen the episode before, when Tony explodes and kills Ralphie, it's definitely something that you don't see coming. So, I will say this though, I think when Ralphie dies, this season is still good and is still watchable, but it's not as compelling because Ralphie was such a great antagonist. And Johnny Sack isn't the same, and definitely not Carmine, and not really Carmela either. And episode 10 is when you get the first episode that doesn't have Ralphie because Ralphie is dead. Episode 10 is called The Strong Silent Type. It's directed by Alan Taylor. Features a story by David Chase, Terrence Winter, Robin Green, and Mitchell Burgess. And this is still a good episode, though. Don't get me wrong. It still has a lot of wild shit in it. I mean, it has a whole subplot where Chris is so high in heroin that he kills Adriana's dog because he just sits on the dog and suffocates it to death. And understandably, Adriana is pissed off, but she completely loses it when Chris gets robbed while trying to buy more heroin. And then Adriana tries to suggest that he goes to rehab. Like, he's like, "Hey, go to rehab. It might help you." And then he flies off the handle and hits her in the face. And so Tony finds out about this, and of course he's understandably pissed off. Goes to Junior for advice. Junior says you might want to kill him, but Tony isn't able to go through with it, and instead he sets up an intervention. And this is one of the funniest scenes in the entire season, and in all honesty, the entire show. This intervention that goes completely off the rails is comedy gold. First off, you have Elias Cotiez, who I love, who I've always been a big fan of when it comes to his work. And he's in this intervention sequence. He plays a former mobster who was addicted to drugs and got clean. And so he is given this job by Tony to set up this intervention. And it's supposed to be an intervention where things are not heated. It's not going to devolve into arguments or physical fighting. That's not the point of the intervention. And initially it starts out okay, but then it starts to go quickly off the rails, and it just gets progressively crazier and more ridiculous and hilarious. Because you have Adriana talking about how Chris is impotent because of his drug use. He can't get it up. You have uh, Silvio doing this whole thing where he's all like, I had to hold your hair out of the toilet. Disgusting." And then you have the whole stuff with Paulie where he's like, I don't really write anything down. Christopher, you're a fucking embarrassment. Uh, and he's basically like, "You're a fuck up. You always be a fuck up." And of course, it causes Christopher to explode. Everybody starts fighting. Even prior to that, like, Tony is being supportive of Christopher, and he's like defending Christopher from some of these other statements from the other people in the crew and the other people that are there for the intervention. But then as soon as he finds out that he killed Cosette, Adriana's dog, he's all like, You fucking suffocated Cosette. I ought to suffocate you, you piece of shit." So it's just a dysfunctional mess that ends with Christopher getting beaten up by some of the other members of the intervention. And eventually, though, he does decide to go to rehab. Tony has an equally hostile confrontation with Johnny over the Lupertazzi family not being included in the mortgage scheme. Well, maybe not equally because nobody gets beaten in that meeting. Forgive me for mumbling there and stumbling around with my words. Furio comes back from Italy. Carmela tries to, come up with all these excuses to see him because she really wants to be with him and not with her husband. Junior's new nurse turns out to be supplied by Svetlana. Tony actually winds up having a bit of a fling, maybe not a fling, but has a one night stand with Svetlana. They have sex. Tony cries to Melfi about losing Pyomai. The portrait comes in that features him and the horse, and he orders it to be destroyed. Polly then decides to keep it though, without Tony's knowledge. This is a pretty funny bit where Paulie puts it up on the wall and he's looking up, and every time he looks up at it, he sees Tony and he feels like Tony's watching him. He's creeped out by it. So then he has like somebody adjust the painting so Tony is put in a Napoleon like uniform. So it's it doesn't really remind him completely of Tony. It's just it's somewhat reminiscent of Tony. Like even changes some facial features, and so he can keep the portrait on the wall. Yeah, that's a good episode. I mean, despite some issues, and it was despite some things that aren't nearly as compelling when it comes to the overall arc or the subplots or the narrative, because I really don't care about the mortgage scheme uh, uh, drama with Johnny Sachs and the Lupertazzi family and Tony, and that's really stretched out throughout the rest of the season. By the way, um, but yeah, the intervention scene though just makes that episode into, in my opinion, a classic. Uh, Episode 11 is called Calling All Cars. This one is directed by Tim Van Patten, featuring a story by David Chase and Robin Green and Mitchell Burgess and Terrence Winter, as well as a teleplay by David Chase, Robin Green, Mitchell Burgess, and David Fleebolt. And this one features some really trippy dream sequences that are really well put together, well directed, where Tony dreams about Carmela driving his father's car with him, Ralphie, Gloria, and Svetlana inside. Melfi talks about what that dream might represent, and that leads to him becoming frustrated about the lack of progress in their sessions, and then he decides to quit, which honestly was a bit unexpected, but I welcomed it because I was like, okay, that's something I didn't see coming. And you know what? They've kind of gone as far as they can with the therapy thing here. Uh, and so he quit, and he's not going to go to therapy anymore. Carmela annoys Tony because there's a lot of others. Well, I mean, it's not Carmela annoying Tony. It's Carmela annoying AJ. Uh, because Carmela forced AJ to play with Bobby's kids. So AJ pranks them with a seance to contact their dead mother that leaves them terrified of their mother's ghost. Janice, kind of, she continues with this shit by guiding them to their Ouija board later on, scaring them even more. Bobby comes to Janice for her advice because Janice set it all up because she's a manipulative bitch. And then she manipulates him into eating his wife's last ziti. So, she can continue to have a further hold over Bobby. And Tony continues to uh, not agree to a satisfying cut of the mortgage scheme with Johnny and the Lupertazzi family. He goes to Miami to deal with Carmine's son, little Carmine, who agrees to talk to his father about things. Tony continues to have this creepy, weird dream where he arrives at a house where he waits outside, claiming he is there for a stonemason job. There's a shadowy female figure that descends down the stairs before Tony wakes up covered in sweat. And that's the end of that episode. It's not a bad episode, but there's a lot about it that's like kind of and it's a very short episode too. I think it's only 40 something minutes, which is one of the shorter episodes of the season. Episode 12 is called Eloise. This one is directed by James Heyman, featuring a script by Terrence Winter. And this continues on the stuff with Junior and the trial. Bobby winds up picking a juror at Junior's trial to basically put things into a deadlock by intimidating him to holding out, by threatening his family. Carmine refuses to compromise on the mortgage scheme, which is just like, this is just petty and annoying at this point. Johnny meets with Tony, implies that he should be killed. Paulie encounters Carmine and realizes he has no idea who he is, despite the good word Johnny supposedly put in for him. So that upsets Paulie. He learns that Nucci's friend keeps her money in her house, and so he winds up killing her and then steals the money. He gives a large cut to Tony, which ultimately puts him back on good terms with Tony. After Furio and Carmela almost kiss, he almost pushes Tony into a helicopter rotor. And after that, he leaves for Italy and never comes back. Carmela, who is upset by Furio leaving, she argues with Meadow about the homosexual themes and Billy Budd, which is another element of this show that's ahead of its time. I mean, considering all the controversies associated with LGBTQ stuff in the media nowadays and just in general, like this is definitely something that hits a little harder when it comes to her just being all upset about everything being gay. Uh the arguing continues at Meadow's birthday dinner, and that's when Meadow learns from AJ about her mother's interest in Furio. Tony asks if Carmela is happy with Meadow growing into an independent uh, woman, and she stays silent and then is like, yeah, but you kind of get the gist that she's kind of not, because she's really upset at the fact that Furio left, and now she's taking it out on other people in her life. And this is something that really comes to a head in the season finale, episode 13, Whitecaps, which is directed by John Patterson, featuring a script by Robin Green, Mitchell Burgess, and David Chase. At the beginning of this episode, Junior's trial is declared a mistrial, or maybe not at the beginning, but throughout the episode. It's the predictable outcome, to be honest. Tony agrees to kill Carmine in exchange for all of the profit from the mortgage scheme. He has Chris, who has just gotten out of rehab, um, set up the hit. So he hires his former heroin dealers to take out Carmine. Little Carmine, he winds up reporting, though, that his father is conceded, and Chris then has the dealers killed to prevent knowledge of the attempt from leaking, and then takes the money back that he was gonna give the former heroin dealer guys. Tony starts to purchase a house on the Jersey Shore for his family from this guy named Alan, and this winds up making Carmela feel a lot better. Like, the episode opens up with her going to the doctor and feeling sick, and then she feels miraculously better once she finds out that Tony is thinking about buying this house. And then she guilt trips Tony into buying the house. In the middle of the night, she does this whole thing where she's all like, well, if you are going to buy the house, you should buy it now. But, like, if you don't want to buy the house, that's okay too. So she's just doing her whole manipulative shit with Tony when she wants something. And he actually winds up buying the house. But what happens is Irina winds up calling the house one night because she is pissed off and wants some vindication for Tony ending her relationship with Zellman, and tells Carmela that Tony slept with Svetlana. And this leads to a blow up between Tony and Carmela about infidelities. She orders him to move out of the house. He understandably at this point now doesn't want the house. He doesn't want to buy the house anymore. Needs the money back. But Alan refuses to release Tony from his contract unless he pays a fee. Tony doesn't want to do with it. I mean, doesn't want to pay that fee. He doesn't want anything to do with that. Tony argues with Carmela again, and then she reveals her true feelings for Furio, which causes him to explode even further to the point where he's punching the wall. He calls Melfi, but hangs up and then blocks her number when she answers. Tony has speakers installed on his boat, which then he has his goons drive outside of Alan's house, and they play Sinatra records really, really loudly. And this causes a lot of issues and drama between Alan and his wife, to the point where Alan, uh, it's basically insinuated that he's gonna let Tony out of his contract and give him his deposit back because his wife is just sick of this shit with the Sinatra music, and she realizes that this isn't gonna end well. He's a mobster. Just give him his money back. And that's like the end of the episode, is the whole stuff with the boat and the speakers and everything. And it's a pretty long episode. It's like an hour and 15 minutes. And it's a good one though. It's a great episode. It's a really tough episode because it deals with, the divorce and the separation and Tony almost hitting his wife and the effect that all of that has on his kids. Um but it's still a great episode, especially when it comes to the acting. James Gandolfini and Eddie Falco are just unbelievable in this. They earned Emmys for this episode, and rightfully so. Um, but yeah, that's season 4. It's a good season. I would say it's definitely a season that is well regarded for a good reason. Like, I think it's definitely worth of all of the critical acclaim that it gets. Um, I think it's the last great season, to be perfectly honest. I know a lot of people really like season 5. Um, I don't hate season 5. I think it's still a good season, but this is the last really great one for me personally, though. I think the show starts to kind of decline a little bit after this. Maybe it's because it's no longer the same formula, and it's also the start of the show really focusing heavily on the downfall and everything falling apart. Which, yes, that really does coincide with the typical arc for a mob movie, but that's always been kind of my least favorite part of these mob movies. But it's definitely something that was inevitable. And I do feel that there's still a lot of merit and there's still a lot of good things about the downfall that starts to happen in season 5 and onward, but I just don't really enjoy that as much as the balance of drama and pettiness and just satire and silly mob antics that the first 4 seasons have. Um, but that's my thoughts on season 4 of The Sopranos. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later. See ya.